Hey everyone. So, my name is Brian. This is Distillations. And today I'm going to be talking and reading this amazing article called Kierkegaard's Demonic Boredom by William McDonald. And this really struck me when I found it. Just the title alone, Kierkegaard, check. Demonic boredom, definitely check. I guess I was curious, what is this demonic boredom? What are they talking about here? I've definitely been bored. I would argue that maybe most of my time, most of my adult life might have been consumed by boredom. And so, addressing what's at the root of my boredom or anyone's boredom could be a fruitful area to investigate. And I think also for so much of my adult life, it's been this struggle or battle or fight to overcome boredom and do the right things, productive things, work towards the things that I want to achieve. And boredom seems to be so uh, magnetic. It draws you in, uh, being distracted by doing just about anything other than the things you think that you ought to be doing. And I think just one more point on boredom and why I think this article is particularly relevant and powerful is that in the 21st century, at this moment, our our modern technological moment with the internet and smartphones always available to us, I think being bored is something that a lot of people are familiar with, and the ease to which we can lose ourselves in a whole world that's at our fingertips, the internet, you know, being bored can really consume a whole lot of time, and it's very easy to get stuck in that trap. So I think all those sorts of things are going to be addressed here, and it'll go even deeper and become even more of a meaningful exploration of Kierkegaard's demonic boredom, whatever that is. So let's find out. So let's start with this. I think it's the abstract you call it here at the beginning. Kierkegaard diagnoses modern boredom as both a social phenomenon and as an individual malaise. Okay, so it's both social, so it's something society wide, it's something that we are all experiencing, and it's something that it's a malady, it's a personal malady. It's something that the individual is dealing with and has to contend with. He focuses on a distinctive second order form of boredom, demonic boredom, in which the reflective aesthete affects boredom in order to overcome it through irony. So this is interesting. There's two forms of boredom that we're going to be talking about. And demonic boredom specifically is going to be this second kind of boredom that Kierkegaard is putting out there. And this second demonic boredom is one where the reflective aesthete affects boredom in order to overcome it. Reflective aesthete. So aesthetic, I know that word. It means, it's something to do with what something looks like, the aesthetics of a room, the aesthetics of a painting, the aesthetics of a movie. The aesthetics is sort of, from what I understand, is the the way something looks, the beauty perhaps inherent in a certain thing. But we're talking art, we're talking judging the perceived beauty or lack thereof. I think that might be somewhere in the ballpark. It might be worth looking up. So an aesthete might be someone caught up in aesthetic things. The reflective aesthete, okay, is just maybe someone who's caught up in how things look and appear to them, and is also reflective, so caught up in their own reflectiveness. And what they're doing is affecting boredom in order to overcome it through irony. So to affect boredom, I think, would be to sort of create boredom, to put it on where it might not, you might not be caught, you might not be condemned in this boredom, but you're affecting it. So the reflective aesthete is putting it on themselves, affecting this boredom in order to overcome it, in order to overcome the boredom that they're bringing on themselves. Maybe that's where the reflective part comes in. And they're overcoming it through irony. So a lot of these things I think might need a little deeper dive. Irony is all over the place these days. And let's keep going because I'm not quite sure what irony means. I know there's something called Socratic irony, which is distinct from other types of irony, where you're not quite taking things seriously. You're being ironic. That's a tough one. There's a lot that would go into that. Modern boredom is construed as an aesthetic and psychological problem. Okay, so now we're adding psychological to the mix, which consists in a lack of resources to make life interesting. So this modern boredom, it's aesthetic, which we talked about, but it's also a psychological problem. So it's something to do with psychology, something to do with the mind and the way the mind works. And this modern boredom is consisting in a lack of resources to make life interesting. So you don't have what it takes to make your life interesting, in quotes. So maybe interesting here is qualified. There's something we need to learn more about how we're using interesting here. Its antidotes are taken to be distraction or the subjective injection of the interesting. Okay, so it's antidotes to this modern boredom. So trying to solve the problem of modern boredom. Solving it would be through distraction, distracting yourself from being bored, or the subjective injection of the interesting, or injecting the interesting into your life in order to solve boredom. So when they say subjective injection, that is reminded me of the reflective aesthete is affecting boredom. So they're bringing it upon themselves. And here, subjective injection of the interesting is again yourself injecting the interesting in order to solve this boredom. Kierkegaard argues that the modern conceptions of boredom and its antidotes are flawed, since they ignore the spiritual dimensions of Acadia. So we'll definitely get to Acadia. Kierkegaard argues that modern conceptions of boredom. Okay, so he's now talking about how boredom is defined in his time, which was the modern time when Kierkegaard was living. So this is his time. Its antidotes of his time are flawed, so there's something wrong with them. And it's because they're ignoring what is this important spiritual dimension. And the spiritual dimension is called Acadia, and we'll get to that. Demonic boredom is a mood. Okay, so that's new. So this second type of boredom, demonic boredom, it's a mood rather than an emotion. Okay, so it's a mood, not an emotion, and fails to seek its only real antidote in the passion of faith. So here we're getting a bit more explicitly religious or spiritual, depending on how you want to look at it, which can be ignited through spiritual exercises, heartfelt concern for others, temporal reorientation of the self towards eternity, and through finding the fullness of time in the life of Christ. All right. So we're talking Christ here. We are full on into the Christian framing here. But I think it's worth noting that I got a lot out of this article. And while it is explicitly religious and Christian, I think that if you are an atheist or you're spiritual and seeking different ways of expressing or finding what type of spirituality is appropriate to your own life, I think that this article really has a lot to offer. I think Kierkegaard has a lot to offer, and I think there's ways that you can open yourself to the possibility of learning something from something that is a bit more explicitly religious without having to take on, the full Christian tradition. I think Kierkegaard was a particular denomination of Christianity. I can't remember it now, but I know that what he was trying to do was reform Christianity using the Socratic method. So he's engaging in a process of trying to become more Christian in a reformed sense, and that's his project in a way. But what is this saying? Okay, so demonic boredom is a mood. Okay, so that's one thing, rather than emotion, and fails to seek its only real antidote in the passion of faith. Okay, so when you're in this state of demonic boredom, you're failing to seek the real antidote, not the mistaken modern antidotes, but the real antidote is what you're failing to seek. And the antidote, the appropriate antidote to this type of demonic boredom is, here we get religious, the passion of faith, which can be ignited through spiritual exercises, heartfelt concern for others, so actually having concern for others, temporal reorientation of the self towards eternity, so thinking about the afterlife in a more serious way, and through finding the fullness of time in the life of Christ. And I have no idea what that means, so it might end up explaining that. Okay, so now we're getting to section 1. And I'm going slowly through this. I think I'll do some experimenting with you guys and see what you like. I was doing a lot of, the last video I put out, I was doing a lot of reading, and then every once in a while I would pause to talk about what I was thinking about that last section. Right now I'm kind of going line by line, and I'll just see how it goes, and it might be a bit overboard, so we'll go from there. So 1, boredom in modernity. So talking about boredom in Kierkegaard's time, 18-something, I believe. Boredom is not a universal feature of human life, but arises as a distinctive malady of modernity in epidemic proportions. It's not a universal feature of human life. It's something that comes about because we're living or Kierkegaard's living in this specific sort of time, this distinctive malady of modernity. So it's widespread because of the societal or social environment. It's not necessarily something that has to be a part of every human life. It's not a part of every human life. It's a consequence of the time and place. Copenhagen, 18 something with Kierkegaard. I hope I'm right on that. I could be wrong on that. This epidemic is accompanied by a burgeoning of discourse about boredom in the 19th century, which both mirrors the epidemic and helps to propagate it. So there's more talk about this boredom that everyone's going through. The modern concept of boredom is distinct from the medieval concept of acedia in belonging to a different discourse, which is produced by different institutions, entirely different institutions. It is conceived as a psychological malady, a social malaise, or an aesthetic challenge rather than as a sin. So when we're talking about boredom, this new definition of boredom, it's not medieval. It's not the one that medieval Christians were talking about. And they had their own idea of what it means for someone to be bored. They had a very specific understanding of what it meant for someone to be bored. And that went by the name of acedia, which we'll learn about. This modern type of boredom, it's produced by different institutions. It's a different discourse. This is this modern thing now. It's not a sin as it used to be understood in medieval times. It's something new. Its antidotes, this modern boredom, are conceived as either distraction by means of busyness or by craving the interesting, or as transfiguration of experience through intensification of the imagination. So this new type of boredom that we're talking about, the way that I think we are bored in the 21st century, very possibly, to solve being bored, what do we do? What do we do today? Well, you could become a workaholic. You could work all the time. You could fill up your day-to-day schedule with activities and events and things you have to do, and thereby you're busy all day and you don't have any free time to contemplate how you would be feeling if you did have that free time, and you would be feeling bored if your day wasn't jam-packed with all of these activities. And so you're distracting by means of busyness. Or, here's another way you can distract from this boredom, is by craving the interesting. So that, I think I probably fall into that category where I'm not filling up my day. I'm scrolling YouTube. I'm watching all sorts of YouTube videos of different philosophers and all this noise that is everywhere these days. You can very easily crave the interesting BS, just interesting BS. And thereby, again, you're distracting yourself from what you would be feeling, which is very bored moment to moment, if you weren't just on this constant pursuit for the interesting. And here's this third thing, or as transfiguration of experience through intensification of the imagination. Or you can, by your own powers, lose yourself in a fantasy land. You can daydream, and again, another form of distraction, you can daydream your way away from boredom and just be lost in a world of your own making. So these are three different worlds that you can become lost in order to to distract yourself from being bored. One is you kind of lose yourself in the world of society. You're busy. You have all of these things that you have to do that are making demands on your time. So you get lost in the world, the social world. The other is the interesting. So you can get lost in the world of the mind. You can seek the things that your own curiosity is calling out to you, and you can lose yourself in things out there that grab your attention, and by means of your mind. So it's an intellectual sort of world. Or lastly, transfiguration of experience through intensification of the imagination. You can construct your own fantasy world and lose yourself in the fantasy world. Rather, so all these three are all rather than as spiritual discipline, patient devotion, or penance. So the other way of doing it, the medieval way, the Acadia path, which I think Kierkegaard is saying is the true antidote to boredom, is to fill this time, is to distract. Perhaps it's not distracting, perhaps it's real engagement now with solving this problem of boredom. You're not just trying to escape it. You're not just trying to distract yourself from this boredom. You are spiritually disciplined. Patient devotion or penance. You are meditating every day. The time you're spending is time alone with yourself and perhaps coming to a greater understanding and mastery of your own mind and what it is like to be bored in maybe the most significant sense, where you really are alone with your thoughts. And let's just take meditation and leave prayer out of it. You are devoting your time to spiritual maturation, spiritual discipline, spiritual growth. And as opposed to hiding from the task of spiritually developing, you are facing it head on and filling your time not in those three fantasy worlds or distraction worlds, one of them being fantasy. Instead of losing yourself in those worlds, you are confronting the spiritual world, which may be the most important or the most real, depending on your worldview, which is totally up for debate. You know, everyone should keep an open mind. Is this even the right way of going about it? Maybe not. So finally now, and it is conceived in purely human, secular terms rather than in religious terms. So this Copenhagen 19th century, 1800s, this form of modern boredom, we're talking about it in a human way, in a secular way. We're not talking about it in religious terms at all. So purely human secular terms. It's a psychological malady. It's something to be distracted from as opposed to engaged with directly in religious terms. As a widespread phenomenon whose causes are rooted in profound social and economic changes, modern boredom seems closer to the ancient Roman tedium vitae than to Acadia. Not sure what that tedium vitae, I'll have to figure out what that means. Both ancient Romans and post-industrial Europeans suffered from changes to the temporal structure of experience caused by urbanization and the artificial administration of time. Which rendered the individual's sense of time empty and meaningless. This seems very relevant. So Romans and post-industrial Europeans. So because of urbanization and these changes, I'm assuming maybe the creation of the clock, this urbanization, the industrialization of the world that's happening, the industrial revolution that's being undergone right now in Kierkegaard's time, all of a sudden I would imagine you aren't waking when there's light out and going to sleep when the sun is setting, when the sun rises and the sun sets. You aren't living by the dictates of nature. You are starting that process of living according to machines, according to technology. That initial shift from natural cycles to mechanized cycles of time. So that would be a big change to undergo that for the very first time, the artificial administration of time. And this renders the individual sense of time empty and meaningless. Empty and meaningless. The reaction in both cases was to seek distraction from tedium in panis et circenses, bread and circuses, or in the case of the cultured, in modernity, to embrace boredom as an aesthetic fashion. It is this latter phenomenon, the aesthetic fashion, that Kierkegaard diagnoses as demonic boredom. So now the reaction to this artificial administration of time, the reaction there was to distract yourself from boredom, just being with yourself. And that might not be right, just being with yourself. But we're trying to distract from this boredom. And one way in Kierkegaard's time was bread and circuses. So again, maybe a societal solution there. There's these entertainment events that are put on that you're going to the circus to distract. Or okay, and that seems like okay, that was low class, I suppose, but the cultured, in modernity, the cultured, they embrace boredom as an aesthetic fashion. And okay, so the way they're distracting, we're going to get to how they distract, and it's in this aesthetic fashion way, and that's called demonic boredom. That's what we're going to get to. So, demonic boredom is an affliction of the leisured classes, epitomized by the English tourist and the traveling member of a spleen club. Okay, the leisured classes. I don't know what this English tourist thing is or spleen club. We can skip that. The latter description aligns boredom with the theory of humors, in which the spleen is the source of the black bile that causes melancholy. Those of melancholic humor are predisposed to mournful reflection, in which they become isolated from other people and from a true understanding of themselves. So these leisured classes who are experiencing demonic boredom are epitomized. Here's an example of someone in this leisured class experiencing demonic boredom. It's someone of a melancholic humor. It's this person that's predisposed to being mournful, to reflecting mournfully about themselves. And the more mournful reflection they do, the more they become isolated from other people and from a true understanding of themselves. So this mournful reflection isn't even allowing them to understand themselves better. And at the same time, it's also isolating yourself from other people more and more. And it is this melancholic lack of self-understanding because of emotional and spiritual isolation, which lies at the root of modern boredom for Kierkegaard, and which therefore demands an emotional and spiritual remedy. That seems pretty straightforward. So it's this lack of self-understanding because you're isolating yourself. You're lost in these worlds, these distraction worlds, and so you become emotionally and spiritually isolated, and that's what's at the root of modern boredom. Modern boredom are these isolating factors. And so if you're going to solve that, you need an emotional and spiritual remedy. You have to go right at the problem. Demonic boredom arises when the melancholic aesthete affects boredom in an ironic pose to distance himself from the mundane busyness of modern life. This ironic pose, distancing yourself from modern life, we'll have to get into that. I'll keep going because I think there's more to be said on that. Irony. You're taking this ironic pose and you're distancing yourself. Unfortunately, his feelings of boredom paralyze him emotionally, and his aesthetic irony isolates him spiritually, so that he becomes self-enclosed. So this is the leisured class boredom. This is someone who doesn't have to engage in the mundane busyness of modern life. And so you're able to take on this melancholic, ironic pose to distance yourself from that mundane busyness and to deal with the boredom. You're paralyzing yourself emotionally. And the aesthetic irony, kind of taking everything as a joke, having this distance, isolates you spiritually. And so then you are totally self-enclosed. But rather than despair at his paralysis and isolation, the bored aesthete revels in them defiantly and seeks to become psychologically autarkic. I think that means psychologically your own boss, by manipulating memory and forgetfulness, and by the prudent rotation of moods. So the bored aesthete, you're reveling in how melancholic you are. You're reveling in your depression. You don't take anything seriously. You have this ironic pose that has to do with aesthetics. So you're judging everything in what's aesthetic, what's not aesthetic, and in this judgment and in this ironic pose where everything is also potentially a joke, everything is potentially something that you can distance yourself from in order to have this irony, in order to play with this gap that you're creating. By doing this, you're trying to be the master of your own mind and manipulating memory, and you do this by manipulating memory and forgetfulness and the prudent rotation of moods. So in order to stay in this state and kind of your attempt to solve boredom in this way has to do with you manipulating your moods, manipulating your emotions. And in a way, this could be scrolling TikTok for 4 hours, 5 hours a day, scrolling YouTube, finding new YouTube videos to watch, as opposed to just meditating. So this could be an example of you're reveling in the fact that you're bored, and you are setting up your days so that you manipulate how it is you're spending your time, your prudent rotation of moods to defiantly stay the way you are. And I don't know if you haven't picked it up. I think all of this applies, to myself. That's why this struck me so powerfully, because I can see myself and I can see the past 10 years or so. I can see that in this demonic boredom so strongly. The demonic aesthete himself diagnoses boredom as a failure of imagination. So if you're bored, it's just because your imagination isn't working hard enough. You haven't imagined the solution. You haven't logicked your way out of being bored. That's this treadmill, that's this rat race of being convinced. Like, I was convinced that I was in this rut, this many year long rut, and that I was going to figure it out. I was going to be psychologically autarkic. I was, in charge, and it was a failure of my imagination. I just wasn't being creative enough to solve my own boredom. I hadn't figured it out yet. If I haven't figured it out yet in this way, then it's just a failure of my imagination, is what boredom is. This feeling, this melancholic feeling. This failure is a product of industrial urban temporality, with its acceleration of the tempo of life into a mechanized busyness and the leveling of values in mass society. So this failure of imagination is a product of the societal environment where we are technologically, and how temporality has been changed at this moment in the Industrial Revolution, 1800s, and then I would argue today, for sure, into mechanized busyness and the leveling of values in mass society. The demonic aesthete asserts that all people are boring, but they may be divided into two classes: those who bore others and those who bore themselves. So this demonic aesthete, this ironic, someone trying to distance themselves and be ironic, and they're reveling in their own boredom and melancholy, and they are judging aesthetics everywhere. And what they say is that all people are boring. Everyone's boring. But there's two types. There's people that bore others. So when they're talking and everything, oh, this person's so boring. Not worth my time. Not worth any kind of interest in this person who just bores others. And those who bore themselves. Oh, and then there's someone else who is boring themselves. They're not able to do anything worthy of being interesting. They are literally boring themselves. They are probably caught in this reflective, aesthetic, demonic boredom as well. They are bored with their own failure of imagination. They can't even figure it out. They're boring themselves. And in a way, from that vantage point, wouldn't it be nice to bore others? Wouldn't it be nice to not have this reflective, ironic, piece of shit sort of quality to yourself, and you're being genuine, and you're just boring other people. Other people just find you boring, but inside, you're doing fine. You're doing great. So the demonic bored person is kind of looking at those who bore others, looking down. Those who bore others are plebeians. They're literally the plebs. The plebs are plebeians. The crowd, the endless train of humanity in general. Oh, it's such a cynical. It's such a cynical take. The plebs, those who bore themselves, are the chosen ones. The nobility. Oh, just the gall, the balls for someone to be saying this kind of shit. Ugh. The demonic aesthete, of course, assigns himself to the latter class, who in boring themselves tend to entertain others. Hey, if you're going to be a boring person, which we all are, rather be the nobility, the chosen ones, who, when they're bored with themselves, are able to create this space between themselves and others, themselves and the world, and have this ironic pose that allows you to make fun of the world, make fun of yourself, make fun of everything. Might as well be one of those, might as well be a comedian. To be a comedian would be to entertain others with your own demonic boredom. At least you're this nobility class who isn't boring other people. No, you're a chosen one. You're one that can, with this gap that you've created, this ironic pose, this aestheticism, so someone who's in comedy is able to kind of judge the aesthetics of things and with this gap play with the world and situations and life itself, and thereby entertain others. I'm saying thereby a lot, too much. So yeah, of course, reading this, I was like, what the fuck? I think I'm in this. I think I'm this asshole. I think I'm this demonic aesthete who's calling himself the chosen one and entertaining others. My hope with a video like this, with what it is that I'm pursuing, what it is that I'm doing, is that I'm striving or aspiring to get out of this. What I want to fill my time with is heartfelt concern for others, spiritual discipline, meditation, prayer, maybe, if you're open to it. If I'm open to it, I am open to that sort of thing. What I am aspiring to is not just entertaining others. If, I could just be sharing purely interesting shit that I think might be popular amongst people and, farm for likes or farm for virality. I hope, and I'll leave it here, I hope that what it is that I'm doing here is striving to take that next step. And in doing so, isn't purely entertaining. There's something else going on here. It can be entertaining and it can have that dual purpose. It could be going beyond this and striving towards, what it is I'm sharing is the thing that's calling out what it is that I might be doing, So it's I want to be aware of this possibility that all it is that I'm doing is I'm caught in this trap of demonic boredom and assigning myself to the latter class who, in boring themselves, tend to entertain others. It's possible that that's all I'm doing is entertaining. I hope not, striving for more than that. However, for Kierkegaard, demonic boredom is more radical and evil than immediate plebeian feelings of the emptiness of time. So for Kierkegaard, that latter class, you're going to pay for calling yourself a chosen one. You're going to pay for that. It's more radical and it's evil. It's evil. Versus the immediate sort of pleb feelings of the emptiness of time. That is not as bad. Demonic boredom is a reflective form of consciousness which has developed a capacity for freedom and self-determination. So demonic boredom, it's consciousness that's able to self-reflect. It's able to bounce back and evaluate the self. It's reflective. You're reflecting. And it's a reflective form of consciousness which has developed a capacity for freedom and self-determination. So it's got both of these things, reflective and a capacity for freedom and self-determination. However, it misuses this freedom in selfish pursuit of cerebral pleasure, and in doing so becomes prey to chance and fate. So while it does have perhaps the good quality of having the capacity for freedom and self-determination, it's misusing this gift of freedom and self-determination in order to pursue bad things, bad ways of distracting from boredom, cerebral pleasure, playing video games for hours on end, going, down the TikTok rabbit hole. You're just out there for the selfish pursuit of pleasure. And you have this reflective form of consciousness that's able to do something more, but you're choosing to only distract from this boredom and revel in your own melancholy, your own depression. And because you're abusing this gift of freedom and self-determination in order to do that, you are going to end up becoming prey to chance and fate. So if you haven't matured at all, if you haven't developed your life in a responsible manner, then if lightning strikes your house and everything goes, all of a sudden you are SOL. You're shit out of luck. You're fucked. You're prey to chance and fate. That's the trade-off. If you want to avoid and distract from boredom in this way by abusing what should be used for self-development and just use it for this selfish pursuit of pleasure, then you're going to be prey to chance and fate. It also suffers from secular hubris in the wake of the anthropological turn. All right, secular hubris. There is no God, everything is secular, and I'm a chosen one. I'm elevated because of this standpoint, after which human beings think they can become selves and understand themselves with human resources alone. Because there is no God, there is no thing outside of myself. I don't have to appeal to anything that is above or just beyond or just other than myself. I think that I can become a fully matured, developed human being with human resources alone. I don't have to appeal to anything outside. I've got it all here. I've already got everything right here, and I can do it myself. I can understand myself with secular human resources alone. And that's a sort of hubris that goes along with this demonic boredom and this perspective of being a chosen one in the nobility. Demonic boredom springs from a misrelation in the constitution of the self. Between the elements of temporality and eternity, from a misrelation between the self and the other, and from a failure to acknowledge the role of God in the constitution of the self. So demonic boredom, this is coming from, you've got this out of whack misrelation in your own constitution of what qualifies as a self. And I believe Kierkegaard has a deeper understanding of what self means. Self refers to a very specific sort of thing. So he's saying there's this very important self that we need to work on. And demonic boredom is springing from this misrelation in the constitution of this thing, of this self. And specifically, here are these dualities, these elements, the elements of temporality, eternity, self and other, something outside of the self. And then also, this secular hubris, the failure to acknowledge the role of God in this constitution. So there's something outside of the self that is helping to constitute this thing. The individual fails to give sufficient weight to the eternal in the task of becoming a self, so that everything becomes unbearably light. And I just want to pause here at so that everything becomes unbearably light. That, the first time I read it, hit me very hard. So moment to moment, living life, trying to progress, there's this phase that you can get stuck in where you just fail to recognize the immensity of the task you're undergoing, becoming a self. And when you do that, sort of if you give up on the project altogether of becoming a self, everything just is light, and light in a way that can be fun. And so now we're back to that, the demonic aesthete, he's bored himself, and in that being bored with himself, he can entertain others. When everything is light, everything is play, everything has the potential to be distanced from, creating that gap. And the ironic pose is you can only take an ironic pose if everything is light. If everything is light, it can be picked up and moved. Everything is a piece on a board that can be reorganized. You can remake it. You can play with it in a very spontaneous sort of way. If you're not giving sufficient weight to this task, though, and you're stuck in the phase where everything is light all the time, every day, day in and day out, of course you're going to be demonically bored. It's like, what's the point of everything's light? Nothing really matters. And yeah, have some fun, entertain some others, but there's nothing drawing you forward. There's no extra something that is giving orientation or direction to what it is you do every day. In that case, when you're faced with boredom, you're going to be distracting in all those kinds of ways. Without the gravitas of eternal salvation to give direction, temporal existence degenerates into a series of arbitrary nows, which are only distinguished by relative intensity of mood. So again, eternal salvation, up to you, take it or leave it. But the gravitas of something else that can give you direction, then temporal existence is just this series of arbitrary nows. And I think even if you strive to live in the now and maybe even pursue some meditative Eastern ideas of the importance of now, which I think can be very important, you're at the risk of even giving it extra significance in that way. If there's no direction, if you're not moving towards something, then it could just be an arbitrary series of nows. Although I would say if you are kind of pursuing that idea of the now, living in the now in a more spiritual or Eastern sense, then you're probably engaging in some sort of project of improving yourself. You're probably moving in the direction of wanting to constitute the self in a way that is other oriented. You're trying to transcend perhaps your current state, recognizing now, the importance of the now. So with that caveat, the aesthete caught up in the distractions and busyness of modernity only finds purpose in the pursuit of the interesting and its converse, flight from boredom. So the demonically bored, the aesthete, caught up in the distractions and busyness of this world we find ourselves in, the modern world, 21st century, internet access, Netflix, YouTube, scroll, Reddit, the world at your fingertips. If you are caught up in the distractions of that sort of thing, then you only find purpose in pursuing the interesting, dopamine hits, in pursuit of dopamine hits. Either that, or you're just trying to not be bored. Flight from boredom. Maybe you go off into your own fantasy world. Intensification of the imagination, like we were talking about. The pursuit of the interesting here. And then there was a third way. The bored aesthete, however, fails to connect to other people through concerned emotions, and therefore sinks back into moody self-enclosure. So the bored aesthete fails to connect to other people through concerned emotions. You're just not able to get there. You're not able to even connect to another human being. You're not able to access concerned emotions for someone outside of yourself. And therefore, you're right back into melancholy, into depression, into that moody self-enclosure, into that reflective consciousness where everything is just cycles of self-reference, which I identify with strongly. It's getting out of that situation that's important. It's aspiring to move on from this stage that's important. Kierkegaard categorizes boredom as a mood, along with the related moods of irony, melancholy, anxiety, and despair. So boredom has all these things associated with it: irony, melancholy, anxiety, despair. That sounds right. Moods lack determinate objects and are pervasive, if ephemeral, states of mind which condition the individual's whole orientation to existence. Okay, so that's a definition of moods. Moods are these determinate objects. They're pervasive states of mind. They're pervasive in your mind. They're everywhere. And these are the things that are conditioning your orientation towards existence. These are the direction objects, determinate direction objects. These are the drop a pin. Moods are drop-in pins for your GPS of where you're going. And they're always there. They're pervasive. These moods are unhappy attunements to aimless subjectivity, and border on solipsism in isolating the individual from empathetic and emotional connection with other people. So these moods, irony, melancholy, anxiety, and despair, and boredom, these moods are unhappy attunements to aimless subjectivity. So you're dropping pins, but the pins aren't going anywhere. They're not going there. The pins, it's all in your mind. The pins are only going from one end of your lonely mind to another end of your lonely mind. Aimless subjectivity. You're not able to actually drop a pin outside of your mind. You're not able to get out of your mind and have any kind of concerned emotion and connection with another human being. It's unhappy attunements to aimless subjectivity and border on solipsism. And solipsism is the idea that only my mind exists. It goes all the way to Descartes and, his I think, therefore I am. The only thing you can confirm is that your own mind exists and everything else is an inference. So this actually, gets at a very fundamental philosophical problem. It's also called the problem of other minds. So it's this difficulty with which is that I can only access my own mind. And so to infer that another mind has a human in it, and it's not just NPCs everywhere, that's a philosophical problem. There's reasoning. There's a chain of reasoning that has to happen here to believe that other minds have subjectivities within them, just like mine. And that's a problem. It's a logic problem. It's a configuration problem. There's something you got to figure out there. You got to do some work to even make that inference. So solipsism is when you really believe that. We're in the matrix, but the matrix is only for me, and I generated the matrix. It's all subjectivity. So that's solipsism. Isolating the individual from empathetic and emotional connection with other people. So if everyone's an NPC, there's absolutely no reason for me to get outside of my mind and respect or attempt to connect with another light of subjectivity. If you can't get outside of your own mind to connect with that other, I'm not sure what to call it, light of subjectivity, then you are condemned to be in this solipsistic existence where you're only ever in your own mind, which is terrible. It's terrible. Moods are capricious, influenced by circumstance and chance, and detract from the individual's capacity for self-determination, even when that capacity has been developed through self-reflexive consciousness. So these moods, anxiety, irony, boredom, these bad moods that are dropping pins, but only in your own mind to other regions of your own mind and never getting outside of your mind to another human being, another subjectivity. These moods are influenced by circumstance and chance. They are totally at the whims of something happening to you. Because if they're all in your mind and something happens to you, then there's no outside of you to be influenced. So your capacity for self-determination is at risk to chance and fate. Because everything is self-referential within the mind. The pins are all in the mind. So if you get struck by lightning, that's it. There's no one outside of yourself that matters in this dropping of pins. You haven't even dropped a pin outside of your mind. Your GPS is spinning in circles in one place. I don't know. The ultimate antidote to these moods is to choose to become a religious self. So again, bear with me. Keep an open mind here with a religious self. I think you can interpret this in ways that I just think are worth exploring, this idea. But the path to selfhood requires the integration of character through building up dispositions to positive emotions, such as patience, perseverance, hope, faith, love, and joy. So the ultimate antidote to this problem of the demonically bored aesthete who is subject to just these moods that are sort of ephemeral and just not allowing him to get anywhere outside of himself. You're in this prudent rotation of moods. So you're okay, I want to feel, entertained. So I'm going to watch this many TikToks in a row. And so, I'm addressing my anxiety in this moment. Okay, now it's time to eat, so I'm going to eat something and I'm addressing my hunger. You're just in this rotation of all these moods. And the antidote to this boredom with that is to become a religious self. It's to be alone with yourself in a meditative, spiritually significant way. In a way, it's sort of ironic. I'm risking myself being guilty of using irony here. But it's almost like the solution is to be alone, but not in this. It's to understand the true nature of, your spiritual self through meditation, prayer, patience, devotion to, it's about attending to your spiritual state of being in a alone setting when you're by yourself. And that is the way of getting outside of yourself, contemplating the ultimate, something that's ultimately outside of myself, the other, God, something beyond. While Kierkegaard regards boredom as a problem which the afflicted individual must address, he also sees it as a social problem generated by a culture of narcissistic reflection, superficial distraction, gossip, busyness, and secularity. So it is a problem for me. I'm going to have to deal with it on my own. Like I was just saying, it's something sitting by yourself and going on that inward journey, that inward and upward oriented journey. That's something you're going to have to do as an individual, but that doesn't mean that environmental factors aren't playing in here. It doesn't mean that it's not also a social problem generated by a culture of narcissistic reflection. So, reflecting upon yourself in a narcissistic way without any outside of yourself goal of connecting with others, but just everything sort of being self-reflective. Superficial distraction, so getting lost in those worlds, gossip, busyness, secularity. The age lacks passion and seriousness. So if anything, that's what I'm trying to bring to the table is seriousness about what it is I'm doing right now, and passion for it. And the task of the individual to become a religious self in this context is thereby made more difficult. So to do it, so for me to be doing this, where on YouTube, maybe I could be talking about something interesting that I think other people will find interesting. Maybe it's only self-help quotes. Maybe what I share is only very kind of, low-hanging fruit, business advice, self-help. I don't know. And I think you can make those things perhaps, part of this more serious and passionate project of becoming a self. But, only looking for virality and only looking for likes and shares and seeking things only for the social spreadability, only looking for the interesting. That's not what's going on. The age lacks passion and seriousness. There's not enough engaging with dropping a pin outside of yourself. There's not enough trying to strive, aspire for this orientation. So let me quickly also say, I feel like another way of thinking about this is to get outside of yourself, you have to, the demonically bored, or just the regularly pleb bored, whatever it is everyone kind of looking horizontally. It's like everything is on the horizontal plane. Everything that they're doing is, and all the distractions from boredom, in order to not realize that everything's on the horizontal plane, you're only looking there, when really what needs to happen in order to get outside of yourself is to look up and realize that there's a vertical dimension to reality. There's a vertical aspiring dimension that is possible to engage with, but it's going to require not being bored in these ways, filling your time not with distractions or pursuits of the interesting and these worlds, fantasy, intense imagination, not these things, but looking up, being on the Z axis. That's the change, I think. Or that's one way, perhaps. I'm probably projecting here onto the article, but I think that's one way of thinking about this. Lacking passion and seriousness is just being on the horizontal. Passion and seriousness comes from looking up. Passion and seriousness comes from acknowledging the y-axis. Because modernity prefabricates opinions, social dispositions, attitudes, values, and even the facsimile of faith through the institutions of Christendom. Okay, so they're talking about Kierkegaard criticizing Christianity, like official Christianity, or 18th, 19th century Christianity. Modern individuals are increasingly unaware that they even have the achievement of selfhood as a task. So that's what I was getting at, is that if you're totally caught up on the horizontal orientation and all you can see is either you're spinning in your own mind, or the only thing is distractions that are kind of out there in the world, but they're just distractions from being bored, then you're never even going to know that there is this achievement of selfhood as a task. Look up. You just gotta look up if you're totally absorbed in not looking up. Yet the best hope for awakening awareness of this task lies in the suffering inherent in the afflictive moods themselves. And this, I think, is why Kierkegaard has all of this stuff as sort of stages, a progressive ascending of stage 1, stage 2, stage 3. That's why all of this stuff is broken down in these ways, I think, because you have to go through it. You have to be demonically bored for a period of time in order. You have to be caught up in this internal house of mirrors in order to finally look up. Best hope for awakening awareness of this task lies in the suffering inherent in the afflictive moods, because it's terrible, because you have to suffer through it. That's why, because at a certain point, it's like, fuck this. Enough is enough. I can't just be caught in my own bullshit forever. There has to be something more. Because just looking at, prefabricated opinions, social dispositions, attitudes, values, just being caught up in what's going on TikTok or what's going on YouTube, being caught up in the news, that's going to leave you suffering just as much as, demonic suffering of your own fantasy worlds or whatever. You have to suffer through this stage in order to awaken to the up, the vertical versus the horizontal.